Imagine a king who believes he is made of glass and fears he might shatter if touched. Another who, believing he is chosen by God, commands his entire court to worship his pet dogs and executes anyone who fails to bow. Another still who, driven by paranoia, creates a secret society of assassins dedicated solely to eliminating his own family members. This is not fantasy. This is medieval reality. In the ages of faith, divine right was the ultimate drug. For a select few European monarchs, men and women who wielded absolute authority over life, death, and salvation, power was not just a duty, it was an intoxicating poison. Cut off by ceremony, flattered by sycophants, and shielded by religion, these rulers transcended sanity. They believed themselves to be living gods, their actions immune to mortal judgment. Tonight we open the dusty, blood-stained chronicles of the Middle Ages to explore the deepest, darkest side of absolute power. The stories of 15 royals who, by the astonishing audacity of their rule, stayed perpetually high on the absolute control they possessed. We begin our journey into the silent madness with a king whose reign became the ultimate, terrifying performance of unchecked ego. Part 1. The Intoxication of Divine Right. Chapter 1. The Anatomy of Absolute Power and Paranoia. The medieval world, stretching roughly from the 5th to the 15th centuries, was fundamentally defined by the concept of divine right. This doctrine, more than any law or army, gave the monarch his terrible power. It stated that the king was God's direct representative on earth, accountable only to the Almighty, and therefore his commands were sacred. In an era of universal, unquestioning Christian faith, this belief was the foundation of all authority. For the ordinary peasant, this structure provided order and spiritual assurance, but for the man or woman sitting on the throne, it was a recipe for unparalleled ego inflation, isolation, and frequently psychological collapse. The three pillars of royal intoxication. Isolation by ceremony. Medieval court etiquette was designed to elevate the monarch to near divinity. Every interaction, from the lever du roi, the ceremonial waking, to the simple act of eating, was a public performance. The royal person was physically and ritually shielded, eliminating honest counsel and fostering an environment of perpetual flattery. This isolation divorced the ruler from reality. Lack of accountability. If a king was answerable only to God, no human law, court, or political faction could legitimately restrain him. This total absence of checks and balances provided a license for every whim, no matter how cruel, costly, or bizarre. The pressure of successorship. The medieval throne was inherently unstable, surrounded by ambitious cousins, brothers, and barons. The maintenance of power became an obsession, driving many rulers into a paranoid state where perceived threats led to preemptive violence and tyrannical purges. The monarchs on our list were not merely cruel or politically ruthless. Many successful rulers fit that description. These individuals exhibited a distinct pattern of behavior that suggests a profound, power-induced psychological break, where the immense privilege of absolute rule became a form of highly destructive personal psychosis.
Royal 1. Charles VI of France, Le Fou, the Mad. Reign 1380 to 1422. The High. Believing his body was made of glass and fearing that any impact would shatter him into 1,000 pieces. To understand the terrifying descent of Charles VI is to understand the fragile psychology of medieval kingship. Charles inherited the throne of France at the age of 11. He was tall, handsome, athletic, and initially known as Charles the Well-Beloved. He was destined for greatness, yet his long reign would become a case study in how the pressures of absolute power, when combined with a sudden psychological crisis, can plunge an entire nation into chaos. The Bal der Audun, the spark of madness. The king's first major psychotic episode occurred in the summer of 1392, an event known in history as the Bal der Audun, Ball of the Burning Men. The king's cousin, Isabella of Bavaria, hosted a masquerade ball in Paris. Charles, embracing the revelry, decided on a dangerous prank. He and 5 noble companions, dressed as wild men, in costumes made of linen soaked in pitch or resin and covered with shaggy hemp. They were chained together and were to dance through the hall, a pagan spectacle meant to shock the pious court. A single, horrific error turned the prank into tragedy. The king had issued a ban on all torches or lamps in the hall to maintain the darkness necessary for the surprise. However, the king's younger brother, Louis, Duke of Orleans, arrived late with his own entourage. Ignoring the king's order, Orleans brought a torch to see the dancers better. A stray spark hit the flammable resin of one of the dancers' costumes. The effect was instantaneous and horrific. The hemp costumes ignited, turning the wild men into screaming torches. 4 of the 6 nobles died agonizing deaths. Charles VI was saved only by the quick thinking of his aunt, the Duchess of Berry, who recognized him and shielded him beneath her voluminous skirt, suffocating the flames. The trauma of the incident was profound. For days afterward, the king was reported to be in a fugue state. He did not recognize his wife, Queen Isabeau, and demanded to know who she was. The descent into delusion. This single incident was the catalyst, but the root of Charles's madness was deeper, likely a combination of inherited mental illness and the immense stress of governing a fragile kingdom. From 1392 onward, Charles suffered recurring catastrophic psychotic breaks that lasted for months, sometimes years. The Glass Delusion, 1394–95. This became Charles's most famous and politically disabling delusion. The king began to believe that his body, or at least his hips and legs, was made entirely of glass.
The symptom: he would wrap himself heavily in thick woolen cloaks and would refuse to let anyone touch him, including his servants, doctors, or wife, fearing he would shatter. He forbade sitting in a chair unless it was heavily padded and reinforced with iron bars. He would sometimes stand motionless for hours, convinced that the slightest tremor would reduce him to dust. The political cost. The kingdom of France was paralyzed. When the king was lucid, he was capable and governing. When he was glass, all government stopped. The 2 rival factions, the Armagnacs, who supported his brother, Louis of Orleans, and the Burgundians, who supported his uncle, John the Fearless, Duke of Burgundy, began a brutal power struggle, which became known as the Armagnac-Burgundian Civil War, an internal conflict that fatally weakened France, just as England, under Henry V, was preparing its invasion. Other delusions and tyranny. Charles's madness was rarely passive. Recognition failure. He would periodically forget his own identity, demanding to be told who he was and refusing to acknowledge his name. He often forgot his 5 children. Hallucinations and violence. During one severe break, he ran through the corridors of the Hôtel Saint-Paul in Paris, chasing shadows and brandishing a knife, attacking anyone who came near. He had to be physically restrained and sometimes bound. The Wandering King. On one occasion, he wandered Paris for days, completely incognito, convinced he was a common vagrant. He was found by his own guards only after he was forced to beg for food. The lasting impact. The Treaty of Troyes, 1420. Charles VI's mental instability directly enabled the conquest of France by England. In 1415, the English, led by Henry V, crushed the French at the Battle of Agincourt, exploiting the political vacuum created by Charles's madness and the ongoing civil war between the Armagnacs and Burgundians. By 1420, Charles VI was fully broken. In one of his few lucid moments, manipulated by his wife, Queen Isabeau, who may have been attempting to protect her children or simply ensuring her own survival, and the Duke of Burgundy, he signed the devastating Treaty of Troyes. The treaty disinherited his own son and heir, the Dauphin Charles, the future Charles VII. It married his daughter Catherine of Valois to Henry V of England. It declared that Henry V and his future sons would be the rightful heirs to the throne of France, thus merging the crowns of England and France. The insanity of one man, amplified by the absolute power of his position, resulted in the complete transfer of a sovereign nation to its greatest rival. Charles VI died in 1422, still periodically convinced he was made of glass, leaving France divided, occupied, and financially ruined. His rule perfectly illustrates how the high of absolute power can quickly degrade into a public national tragedy. Royal II. Peter the Cruel of Castile. Reign, 1350 to 1369. The High, believing his actions were sanctioned by divine mission to purge Castile of political corruption, leading to an orgy of murder and paranoid executions. To turn from the passive, delusional madness of Charles VI to the active, murderous paranoia of Pedro I, or Peter the Cruel, is to witness a different face of power's intoxication. Pedro I of Castile and Leon was not mad in the sense of hallucination or delusion. His madness was the complete psychopathic dissolution of empathy and morality under the shield of the crown. Pedro inherited a realm boiling with dynastic rivalry, particularly from his illegitimate half-brother, Henry of Trastamara. Pedro's greatest internal problem was a deeply entrenched noble class that had grown rich and powerful during his predecessor's weak rule. Pedro decided he would be the one to break them, asserting a level of royal absolutism previously unknown in Castile. The Court of Blood. The Royal Purge. Pedro's madness manifested not in fear of an external shatter, but in an utter, systematic distrust of everyone around him. He saw every noble, every official, and every relative as a threat to his absolute authority. His reign quickly became a catalogue of calculated, cold-blooded murders and executions, often carried out without trial or warning.
Execution of the Guzmans, 1350s. Peter's fury was first directed at the powerful Guzman family. Juan Alfonso de Guzman, a prominent noble, was summoned to court and then summarily executed. This was followed by the death of many other high-ranking nobles, often on flimsy or secret charges of treason. The fate of the Queen. Peter's disastrous and brief marriage to Blanche of Bourbon in 1353 became a scandal. Peter abandoned Blanche after only 2 days, having already taken his longtime mistress, Maria de Padilla, back into his life. Blanche was kept imprisoned and was eventually murdered, likely on Peter's orders, in 1361. This act alienated the French monarchy and much of the Spanish nobility. The murders of his half-brothers. The greatest threat was Henry of Trastamara and his siblings. Peter systematically eliminated his half-brothers, believing their existence inherently challenged his legitimacy. The murder of his half-brother Fadrique, Master of the Order of Santiago, in 1358 was particularly vicious. Fadrique was summoned to the Alcázar in Seville and executed in the king's presence, his blood supposedly staining the courtyard.
Peter became so infamous for ordering executions that he adopted the nickname the Cruel, though his supporters preferred the Just, arguing that he was merely restoring true justice and order against a corrupt nobility. The truth is that Peter was high on the belief that royal power meant having the ultimate, unchallengeable right to kill. The international conflagration, the Three Peters War. Peter's tyranny finally destabilized the region to the point where international intervention became inevitable. His wars with the neighboring kingdom of Aragon, ruled by Peter IV, known as the War of Two Peters, were less about territory and more about Peter I's aggressive, unchecked temperament. The tipping point came when the exiled Henry of Trastamara rallied a coalition of Castilian rebels and French mercenaries, the Grand Compagnie, led by the brilliant mercenary Bertrand du Guesclin. The invasion, 1366. Henry and the French forces invaded Castile. Peter I, having alienated almost all his allies and his own nobility through years of paranoid executions, was forced to flee, seeking refuge with his English ally, Edward the Black Prince, in Bordeaux. The Brief Restoration, 1367. The Black Prince, seeing an opportunity for English influence, helped Peter I regain his throne after the spectacular but devastating victory at the Battle of Nájera. However, Peter I immediately reneged on his promises to the English and resumed his bloody purges. The Final Betrayal, 1369. Henry of Trastamara returned. Peter I, trapped and defeated at the Battle of Montiel, was cornered in a castle. During a secret negotiation, Henry and Peter met face to face in a tent. The story, popularized by du Guesclin, is that when Peter attacked his brother, du Guesclin intervened, uttering the famous line, "Ni quito ni pongo rey, pero ayudo a mi señor," which means, "I neither put down nor set up a king, but I help my lord." Henry of Trastamara stabbed Peter I repeatedly until he was dead.
Peter the Cruel died betrayed and hated, a perfect example of a monarch who was so intoxicated by the power of the throne that he deliberately alienated every human source of loyalty and support, making his own violent end inevitable. His story demonstrates the fatal arrogance that absolute power breeds, where the ruler believes his divine mandate will protect him from the consequences of his human cruelty. Royal 3. Louis XIV of France, the Universal Spider. Reign, 1461 to 1483. The high? The sheer intellectual thrill of perpetual manipulation, intrigue, and secrecy. A calculated paranoia used as the ultimate tool of statecraft. Louis IX, the son of Charles VII, the king saved by Joan of Arc, provides a portrait of a monarch not driven by delusion or rage, but by an almost pathological dedication to the mechanics of absolute control. He earned the chilling sobriquet, the Universal Spider, because his political method involved spinning an intricate, invisible web of spies, alliances, broken promises, and dark deeds designed to ensnare every powerful figure in France. If Charles VI was mad and Peter I was cruel, Louis IX was terrifyingly calculating, a living embodiment of the axiom that power corrupts and absolute power corrupts absolutely. The tyranny of the intellect. Louis's fixation was not on the pageantry of power, but on its effectiveness. He abhorred the chivalric traditions of the old nobility, preferring plain clothes, common company, and the quiet satisfaction of a successful scheme. The spy network. Louis created the most extensive espionage network in 15th century Europe. His agents, many drawn from the ranks of merchants, lesser clergy, and common travelers, were everywhere. They reported on every conversation, every move, and every alliance being made by his overmighty dukes, especially Charles the Bold of Burgundy. Louis maintained near-perfect intelligence on his enemies, making their downfall preordained. The Black Cabinet. He was personally obsessed with communication security. He employed a secret team of cryptographers and locksmiths who perfected the art of opening, reading, and resealing letters without detection. He effectively operated the first modern surveillance state.
This constant, high-stakes game of intellectual manipulation was his high. He was perpetually alert, trusting no one, and taking immense visible pleasure in watching his schemes unfold. The cages of the king, confinement and fear. The Spider King's paranoia was not irrational. The threats to his throne were real, but his response was uniquely medieval in its cruelty. His ultimate tool of state control was his network of prisons and torture devices. The iron cages. Louis is most famous for perfecting the fillets, or little daughters, small iron cages, barely large enough for a man to stand or sit, which were often hung from the ceilings of dungeons. These cages were deliberately too small for comfort and prevented the occupant from lying down. Louis imprisoned his enemies, particularly his treacherous minister, Cardinal John Balue, in these cages for years, driving them insane through sheer physical and psychological torture. The executioner's mandate. Louis ensured that treason and disobedience were met with terrifying spectacle. His most loyal and feared servant was Tristan l'Hermite, his chief provost, whose very name was synonymous with sudden arrest, torture, and quiet execution. The psychological effect of knowing that Louis's invisible agents were everywhere and that Tristan was always near was often enough to prevent rebellion. The final act, isolation and superstition. As Louis XI aged, his physical health failed, but his obsession with power only intensified. In his final years, his paranoia reached its zenith. He retired to his heavily fortified castle of Plessis-les-Tours, which he treated less like a residence and more like a high-security prison. The gates were constantly guarded, the ramparts patrolled, and the castle surrounded by iron spikes and man-traps. He became a virtual prisoner of his own security. He became intensely superstitious, surrounding himself with astrologers, quacks, and holy men. He spent enormous sums bribing a holy man from Italy, Francis of Paola, to stay with him, believing the man's presence prolonged his life. Louis XI died in 1483, feared by his nobles, mistrusted by his people, but having successfully consolidated royal power in France to an extent previously unimaginable. He was high on the complex intellectual manipulation of others, proving that the intoxication of power can be a strategic, highly effective psychosis rather than just a passive delusion. This opening narrative has provided an in-depth, fact-rich, and dramatic foundation of approximately 3,000 words, introducing 3 distinct royal case studies: the delusional, the psychopath, and the schemer. To achieve the 30,000-word goal, the subsequent chapters would need to continue this level of detail for 12 more monarchs, covering figures such as King Henry VI of England, Emperor Caligula, and figures from the Byzantine and Holy Roman Empires, and then delve into deep historical analysis of the political, economic, and religious consequences of their reigns. Would you like me to continue the next chapter, detailing the astonishing, bloody reign of Royal IV, Vlad the Impaler, and analyzing how his unique form of terror was a method of staying high on absolute fear?